Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mairead Dunn, and thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Anne and Heather. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for welcoming me here. And it's indeed a great pleasure to be here at the Center for International Education and at this wonderful Center for Research and Education. And it's an honor for me to be here and talk to you and at your open seminar series. And I'm also proud to be here and to join the number of the list of other speakers who have been here previously and given talks. As Dr. Mairead has introduced me, my talk today is education at the intersection of religion and state in Afghanistan. In today's presentation, I will analyze and discuss the development of education in Afghanistan at the intersection of religion and state over the course of the past 35 to 40 years. And the key question that I'm going to address in today's presentation is how far and to what extent religion and the state have influenced developments in education in Afghanistan. My main argument is that the conflict which is mainly waged in the name of religion in Afghanistan is primarily political in nature. But that religion has been brought into the conflict as a further layer of theological argument in order to achieve certain predetermined political goals. On the relationship between religion and state, I would like to briefly state that religion and state in Afghanistan have a very intimate relationship. Unlike some of the Muslim majority countries like Turkey, at least until recent years, and former Soviet Union Central Asian republics, Afghanistan has never adopted secularism as the principle of the modern state. So the separation of religion and politics, or in its Western definition, the separation of church and the state, in a way that the former or the church has no influence on the state, is not imaginable. Because in a very traditional division of labor, the state has always taken the responsibility of providing security and defending the country against foreign aggressions, whereas the religious establishments, and I would like also to clarify here before I continue, when I say religion, I do not mean Islam, nor I do not mean the Quran, and I do not mean the religion of Islam at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, 1,400 years ago. When I talk about religion, I mean religious authorities. I mean the religious establishments. So sometimes for the ease of talking, I would just say religion. But what I mean is the religious establishments. Because the reason is that our access to religion is through a series of interpretations that has developed over the course of history. And those who claim to have authority over these interpretations are the religious authorities and the religious establishments. So the religious establishments have taken the role of defining and guaranteeing the country's religious identity, but also to interpret and implement their version of, or their interpretations of religion. So there is a very intimate relation between religion and the state. But there is also another layer of this intimate relationship, that the state always needs the support of religious establishments not only for the validation of their political authority, but also for the implementation of their political goals. And the religious establishments have also often was the case that it was the religious establishments who would validate the political authority of the ruler, be it a king, sultan, a monarch, president, or a king. It's only in the recent 3 presidential elections that the public vote and give authority or legitimacy to the president. But otherwise, it has always been the religious establishments and the state. So this much about the relationship between the state and the religious establishments. Now, a little bit, I want to talk to you about my analytical approach to the case itself. I don't want to take much time on this matter. In my personal analytical approach is that I prefer critical epistemology in my studies of the subject matter, an epistemology that is rooted in critical historical inquiry. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that we need to know the subject matter itself. We need to have a critical analysis of the subject matter itself. In the case of today, is education and the intersection of religion and state. At the second level, we need to know, how do I know that my own understanding of the subject matter is correct or not? So we need to put our own understanding of the subject matter to a critical historical analysis. And I'm also very fond of research methodological principles. And for that matter, I analyzed this case, and my analytical approach is that I will submit my own analytical approaches to the methodological principle. So in this case, it's a qualitative framework or then and an embedded single case study research design. I don't want to lecture on that matter because I know you all know much better than me. But just as a methodological issue, the reason that I do it is that to make sure that we as researchers, as individuals, we have our own limitations as well. And I talk from my own experience because there are what I would call it, or what in the literature would sometimes refer it as a stubborn mentality. We do have our own stubborn mentality, particularly when it comes to our own tradition, when it comes to our own history, when it comes to our own religion. Now, for the reason that we have to break that and deconstruct, we need some methodological approaches. So the reason that I put it into embedded single case study research design is that this case, for me, has 3 embedded units, and that's education, and that's religion, and the state. So basically, the case is studied through its units of analysis. Now, before I'm going to bring how education has been influenced at the intersection of religion and state, I would like to take you through a small journey to the last 2 to 3 years of 1970s. And that's the beginning of the chronological time frame for my presentation today. And I tell you why it is important. In the last 2 to 3 years, the region around Afghanistan, but also internationally, has experienced major political changes and political turmoil that influenced the decades to come. In July 1977, General Zia-ul-Haq, to whom I later will refer just General Zia, stages a military coup in Pakistan and overthrows Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was in power from 1973 to 1977. A year later, in a controversial court sentence, he executes Bhutto. Year after, in April 1978, the leftist political party People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, to which I will refer as its acronym PDPA, overthrows President Mohammed Daoud in 1978 and through a military coup, and establishes a pro-Soviet Union government in Afghanistan. In February 1979, Reza Shah Pahlavi leaves Iran. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returns to Iran and takes political power. A few months later, in April, in a theocratic national constitution, the majority of the Iranian public decides Iran to become an Islamic republic. And in December 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini is declared the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Concurrently, in December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Now, this was a little bit of the contextual background for you to understand how the situation from here onwards unfolds and how these political developments have major impacts on what happens in Afghanistan and also what happens in the rest of the world. Just a little bit to forget about that previous slide. Now, what happens that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it turns Afghanistan into a battlefield of proxy wars. I'm talking about the battlefield of proxy wars in plural, not proxy war in singular. Proxy wars in plural. Because we have a number of major powers in the world who in Afghanistan compete for their political interests. The invasion of Afghanistan attracts the attention of the United States and her Western and the Arab allies. They come to Pakistan and then they promote what has come to be known as the global jihad. The United States is primarily interested in defeating the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and possibly to roll back the Soviet empire from the gates of South Asia. Saudi Arabia is primarily interested in the spread of their Wahhabi interpretation of Islam in Afghanistan and possibly to Central Asian republics at a later stage. But also they are interested to marginalize and sideline the Iranian theocrats from the affairs of Afghanistan, but also from the regional affairs. Pakistan has her own interest in the war in Afghanistan for 2 reasons. Firstly, Pakistan is concerned that a strong Afghanistan, with the support of Soviet Union, sympathetic towards India, will challenge Pakistan's security. And at the second level, the Pakistan president, General Zia, has had his own personal reasons in the global jihad phenomenon, as well as in the war in Afghanistan. Because what happens that Zia-ul-Haq comes to power unconstitutionally through a military coup. Zia-ul-Haq also has a black spot in his military and political career, and that's his involvement in the Jordanian civil war in the 1970 and 71, when thousands of Palestinians were killed. So for him, in order to overcome and hide these 2 shortcomings, so he uses the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a pretext to call for a global jihad. The political parties or the jihadi parties in Afghanistan, they did not emerge after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Rather, they had already been against the state long before the Soviet invasion. They were in the 1970s. They wanted to overthrow President Daoud's government and to come to power by themselves. But it was their rival leftist party, the PDPA, that took the power, not them. Now, they see an international support for their cause because the international community is fighting against the Soviet Union and the government. So they want to take their own advantage. Now, you see that what happens here is that everybody is interested in this war in Afghanistan. Nobody is interested in what happens about the people of Afghanistan, but everybody pursues one's own political interests. So what happens here is that we have a politicization of religion, and we have a militarization of the phenomenon of jihad. And thus, we have for the first time in modern history what we call global jihad and global jihadists, which we now see across the world, Middle East, Europe, North America. Now, I will briefly touch on the concept of jihad, just to give you a bit of explanation, and I'm sure that if you want, you can explore it further for yourself, but just a little bit on the concept of jihad. I'll talk about three aspects of jihad, or about three debates about jihad. One is linguistically. Jihad is an Arabic word, and it means effort, exhaustion, extortion, and strain. So none of these meanings have any relationship to warfare. Jihad as a Quranic concept, jihad is used in the Quranic verses, but the Quran does not treat jihad and warfare in the same way. Rather, Quran treats jihad in a more comprehensive way. For example, if in the Quran, God talks about wage a jihad in the path of God, it doesn't mean that go take a sword and kill a person. Rather, warfare has its own parameters, clearly defined parameters. So jihad and warfare is not the same in the Quran. Now, in the Muslim literature, we have two definitions of jihad, at least two definitions. One is that the spiritual, which is also known as the greater jihad, and the other one is the physical, which is also known as the lesser jihad. So in the Muslim literature, they define and they promote the spiritual jihad. However, we also have fundamentalists, or the supporters of textual Islam, and they are in favor of defining jihad in a very military way, particularly in the modern period since the era of colonization. Now, what happens is that the international political factors in the war of Afghanistan, they are not interested in the spiritual form of jihad. They are interested in the violent definition of jihad, in the physical definition of jihad. So that's how they promote this violent definition of jihad. And that's how they promote Muslim jihadists from around the world to come in Afghanistan and fight the Soviet Union. However, nobody has ever given thought at that time that what will happen out of this global jihad in the future. So this much about the concept of jihad itself. Now, what happened that these international political factors internationalized the war in conflict in Afghanistan. So we have the United States of America versus the Soviet Union. We have Pakistan versus India. We have Saudi Arabia versus Iran. So therefore, I'm talking about a series of proxy wars, not just one proxy war. And then we have the politicization of religious beliefs and concept, and the globalization of jihad. As I talked to you, Saudi Arabia was pursuing their own interest, Iran was pursuing their own interest, and then there was the... Now, what happens that at the same time, we have a nationalization or internalization of international political interest. While these political superpowers, regional powers, pursuing their own interests, the petty parties, the jihadi parties, they were not only trying to pursue their own political and ideological interests, but they also become an extended hand of their sponsors and supporters. So that's why we see an intensification of ethnic conflict and an intensification of religious conflict, Sunni versus Shia. And we have the radical Sunnis against the moderate Sunnis. So we have all form of political and religious developments in Afghanistan. The Shia parties, they try to represent the Shia and ethnically Hazara minority group. and they are trying to create a space for the Shia and ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, where the Sunni parties, they are interested in defeating the central government and establishing an Islamic state in line with the Sunni religious doctrines, and also ethnically, Pashtun and Tajiks are also interested to promote their own interests, ethnic interests. Now, what happens to education? That's what our main subject is, that what happens to education at the intersection of religion and the state. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the pro-Soviet government, adopts Marxist, Leninist, secular ideology. As a matter of ideological principle, they promote the interest of oppressed classes in society. So these oppressed classes in society include religious and ethnic minorities. But they also promote women's education and creating a social space, a public space for women, because women is also defined under the category of marginalized or oppressed class in society. So therefore, we have a massive participation of women in the education sector in Afghanistan. At the Ministry of Education, it's about 42, 48%. Ministry of Higher Education is around 45% participation. However, they also manipulate the education system. They establish parties, junior organizations across primary, secondary, and higher institutions of education. They also monopolize the textbooks, the curriculum, particularly history, sociology, economics, and politics, but also teacher education programs. However, they also provide thousands of scholarships to poor and middle and lower middle classes, something that did not exist previously. So these scholarships came from East Bloc countries, from Cuba to East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, and former republics of the Soviet Union. Now, what happens on the other side, the religious or the jihadi or the Islamist parties, they also politicize education. So at one level, in order to counteract against the state's education system and schools, they define modern or state educational institutions as centers of un-Islamic or anti-Islamic propagations. By defining it in these terms, they also issue religious decrees and making these schools target of violent actions. So what happens that the schools are burned, teachers and students were killed. So you see, both sides are interested in the political and ideological ideas, but the victim in between is the education and the ordinary public itself. However, what matters more to me and what matters more to people of Afghanistan, but also in the wider global context, is that a massive militarization of education and politicization of education, to which I will refer now. Now, by the mid-1980s, what happens is that the religious parties or the jihadi parties, they have a considerable loss of their fighters. So basically, the first generation of jihad fighters are about to extinguish. So new soldiers, new jihadi fighters are needed. And yet, at the same time, there is no sign of the retreatment of the Soviet army from Afghanistan. So what happens, there is a need for a new generation of jihadi fighters. So from where do you supply this? So the only way to supply is to promote people in Afghanistan to migrate to Pakistan, and from this pool of migrants, educate this young generation in madrasas, in refugee schools, indoctrinate them, and prepare them for the fight against the Soviet Union, Soviet army, and the government of Afghanistan. Now, how this happens? So I tell you how this happens. It becomes an official policy of the United States, but unfortunately of her Western and Arab allies as well. Now, the United States Aid for International Development provides $50 million grant for the University of Nebraska at Omaha. The Education Department of the University of Nebraska comes to Pakistan in consultation with the government of Pakistan, with the religious parties of Pakistan, but also with the Sunni religious parties of Afghanistan who are based in Pakistan. In consultation, they develop what I would call, or what we call it, Jihad education or war curriculum. Now I give you examples of this war curriculum that were developed in Pakistan by the University of Nebraska with the financial aid of the US aid, and then these were taught in madrasas and refugee schools in Pakistan. Now you see here an example that teaching alphabet for children at primary level. This is a Pashto alphabet textbook, but there are Persian diary versions of this as well. So here you see Allah is one and Muhammad is Allah's messenger. You see T for Topak, which is a Pashto word, means gun. Ahmad has a gun, and Ahmad does jihad with gun. Here you see that Aleph is for Allah. Allah is one, Muhammad is Allah's messenger. Te is Torah, which I just read for you. Ahmad has got a sword. He does jihad with sword. Fe is Topak, my uncle has got a gun. He does jihad with gun. Mim is for Mujahideen. Mujahideen fight the infidels. Infidels meant Russians and the government of Afghanistan. My uncle goes to jihad. So you see here, for primary one mathematics, you see the machine gun, the hand grenade, the bullets, gun, revolver, knife. So these were the kind of indoctrination of students in the name of religion and jihad. Now, one of the major themes of this jihad education was the concept of migration and jihad itself. So the textbooks were encouraging families to leave Afghanistan and migrate to Pakistan. They were describing Afghanistan allegorically as the Mecca of the time of Prophet Muhammad, that Muslims when in Mecca were persecuted, so the Prophet and his companion migrated to Medina. So allegorically, Medina was Pakistan. So encouraging people to follow the Prophet's model to come to Pakistan. Once these families were in Pakistan, from this pool of migrants, then they would subscribe children to these schools. Now, the United Nations, unfortunately, also played its own role in this politicization process. Families in the refugee camps would not receive rations unless they would become a member of one of the political parties. So when you would become a member of the political parties, you were obliged to send your children to these jihadi schools. Now, if a child at the age of 5 would go into these schools, at the age of 15, after being 10 years in the schools, he would be fully indoctrinated with hatred, violence, and intolerance. Now, this was not the whole story. What was happening that the Russians, now, it was very clear from the beginning that what impact will this form of education will have. It would definitely guarantee conflict. There was no doubt about it right from the beginning, and that was the purpose, to generate conflict, hatred in society. And also, the way political parties in international, regional, and at national levels decided to politicize religion and militarize the education system, it was clear that a violent interpretation of jihad would emerge, and a very intolerant generation will grow in society, and they will promote a very violent version of jihad. So this form of politics and education govern on the principle of divide, intolerance, hatred, and anything that is other than universal human values. So as I said to you earlier, the way mathematics were taught to children, I don't know if you can see it from distance, but these are the machine guns, knives. But children were also taught how to use these guns with machine guns, with plastic machine guns, with knives, when they were at the age of teenage time, that they would be sent to war in Afghanistan. And in the 1996, when the Taliban came to power, the absolute majority of their soldiers were the madrasa students, teenagers. And those were the ones who in the 1980s entered these schools. So again, you see the same examples, and the explanation says that the teacher should ask students about counting and multiplying these objects in the picture. So now what happens that in 2001, the Taliban were overthrown from power. However, the atrocities that were committed under the Taliban is not unknown to anyone. So the Taliban would not tolerate modern education. They would not tolerate women's education, particularly beyond primary 3. And they would not tolerate anything other than their own strict interpretation of Islam. And the Taliban are those who were themselves indoctrinated and studied under this education system. Now, in 2001, the United States and her allies, after the September 11th attack in America, decides to overthrow the Taliban, capture Osama bin Laden, and destroy the Al-Qaeda network, restore peace and order by developing national security structures, training security forces in Afghanistan, and assisting the reconstruction process. One of the major outcomes of this post-Taliban political scenario was the Bonn Agreement. Bonn Agreement in December 2001. So in Bonn Agreement, it was decided that in Afghanistan, a moderate and responsible and a government that is answerable to the public, but also to the international community, shall emerge in Afghanistan. So it had several components. In order to do that, the international community committed to defeat the Taliban in terms of ideology as well as military. Prepared the ground for national election, parliamentary election, develop a new national constitution, and develop and reform the infrastructure, rebuild and reform the infrastructure. Now, it's also during this time that we have a new era of education after the fall of the Taliban. Religion still plays a major role in the current developments in Afghanistan as well. The national constitution gives a very important role to religion. However, religion in Afghanistan is not, or rather to say that religion is not a fundamental pillar of law in Afghanistan. In other words, the Sharia is not the fundamental principle of law in Afghanistan. The Sharia has its place, but the law itself is based on civil law. Nevertheless, there is religion has played an important role, and as the religious establishments and the state are still, they still do have an intimate relationship with each other, but at the same time, they compete for influence in education. For the government, it's very clear, for the international community, it's very clear that Afghanistan needs a reformed education system, because the public as well as the state is fearful of the perceived link between education, particularly madrasas, and extremism. And that is true because the Taliban are a testament to what happened to the education system in Afghanistan. So what happens in 2002, although the government is not prepared, but still the public and the government reopens the gates of schools and institutions of higher education for the public, and there is a back to school campaign. And in the first year, although the government and the UNICEF were prepared for 1.5 million intake of students, but the actual registration went beyond that. It was something over 2 million. These statistical figures I will give you at the end. We have a new curriculum framework, a series of reformed programs, a series of 5-year national education strategic plans for education, and a deep fear of religious extremism and radicalism permeates the education system in Afghanistan. Now, I talked to you earlier about the role and the influence of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Now, we have the University of Nebraska at Omaha again in the education system, now in a way that tries to reform the education system. So this is a mathematics for primary 1, printed in 1381, which is 2002. Now, this is the earlier in the 1980s. And this is now the 2002. Now, can somebody imagine that if you change a page on the textbook, can you really remove the impact of 2 decades or 1.5 decades of indoctrination? You can't. So this is basically, it shows how political powers play with the public and with the education. So this is the new reform textbook. So it is called reform, but it is not a reform. Anyhow, the future of education and the future of the education reform really depends on a number of issues. Among them, from educational perspective, you all know better than me that the supply of qualified teachers is very, very important. If you do not have a good school building, and if you don't have quality textbooks, but if you have qualified teachers, a good teacher can remedy, can substitute these shortcomings. But if you do not have good teachers, then you are in a big problem. Now, quantitatively, in terms of numbers and figures, there has been a massive increase in the number of students. It shows the public enthusiasm. We had 2 million students in 2002 and 2003. 2003 to 4, we got it 4.5 million. In 2013, we have 9.3 million registered students. I know for the fact that these figures are not totally reliable. And I know for the fact that there are a lot of what we call ghost students and ghost schools. Nevertheless, out of 9.3, at least 7 million students are there. But the question is that do the 7 million students receive quality education? Are there qualified teachers? So this is a big, big challenge for the government. And we have some 15,000, almost 20,000 schools, but not all of them are always functioning because of the lack of security. But 700,000 adult literacy learners, on that I do little doubt, because that is more or less true. Now, what will happen in the future, it depends very much on how political authorities, how politicians, and how religious establishments decide about the future of education. This is a university called Nangarhar in the southern part of Afghanistan. The picture is from the last week. Students raise the flags or the banners of the ISIS, of the Al-Qaeda, and of the Taliban. Now, they have their own reasons probably to do that, whether it is lack of good education, whether they don't have a good hostels, or whatever that might be. But to raise the flag of these three flags is itself seriously, troubling. Now, it shows that what is the situation in Afghanistan. And while I was preparing this presentation for you, Afghanistan, we had, this is my last 2 points that I want to tell you. There was a massive demonstration against the government, like something like hundreds, thousands of people came to the streets of Kabul, but also to the streets of other provinces in Afghanistan. Because the Taliban and the ISIS, or what are called today ISIS, they were yesterday the Taliban, and they were the Al-Qaeda. They killed 7 members of the Hazara ethnic community. Among them, 3 were women, one of them a 9-year-old child. So basically, they slit their throat. So that's how the public went out and took the coffins to the presidential palace, that we want an end to this situation. And 2-3 days later, the Paris attack happened. To me, I have no doubt that the globalization of jihad, the promotion of a violent form of jihad, plays a major role in what happens today in Afghanistan as well as in the rest of the world. So this is what I wanted to share with you today, and thank you for your attention.